Hi, Curt. We meet again.
Good morning, Dr. Brad. It's Sunday, February 5th.
It is, and this will be episode 230202. And please hit like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can know when we make a new one. Don't forget.
It's kind of disturbing. You're so good at this. It's like you sound like a fucking radio announcer. It's
I'm
disturbing.
getting that way because I've been practicing on my online work, sir.
Yes, I see.
25,000 people.
Yeah, I don't think the audience knows how many patients you see. Is kind of terrifying.
I find it very interesting.
Neural adaptation to massive human interaction.
It's like a super socializing program for me. And what's interesting about it is that the only variable is who plays the patient.
I see three ways you can mean it. Do you mean, am I playing you, like manipulating you, or who is acting in the role of the patient?
Acting in the role of the patient.
Right. It is. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean you could act in the role of the patient, or is that the patients are like an archetype of only so many?
There's only probably 9 categories of problems that make 99.9% of the things I see.
Yes.
So it's like this. So it's like, who's playing the person with the urinary tract infection today?
Okay.
And are they mad at me? Right? And it's like, you know what I mean? All ages, whoever. It's just interesting. And what's so it's like your Groundhog Day, right?
Yes.
It's like, so I just do it over and over again, and it smooths out my presentation. So I get more interested in things like the modulation of my voice.
Oh, I see. So most of the things you encounter are just routine, right? And so it develops a pattern. And you're pretty. I was just teasing him about how observant and precise are his observations. So I was just the audience saw this, didn't see this and so I'm like, well, but you still notice if somebody's usually in the category like this and they're like a little far off, you still notice, right? Yes. Right. So it's not like you can just take for granted, oh, it's one of those. You still have to keep
you're paying attention to these like minor variations.
Yes.
But it's like mostly they're not significant variations.
Mm-hmm.
But so the interesting thing becomes your reaction to the variations. And because you're a human being, you're having a reaction to the variation, like you have a response, but you don't project it out into the interaction.
I'm sorry, I just had this pop into my mind and I have to say it. So I'm like, so are you turning into like Dr. Max Headroom?
Yes, that's my model, actually. Just so you know. That's a telltale sign of age, talking about Max Headroom.
And it seems so techie and cool at the time, and now it's like they've forgotten all about it. But I mean, at the time it was fucking hysterical,
right?
It was hysterical.
Yes, sir.
Anyway, so how did I distract you?
We were discussing this. I was reviewing that video with James Lindsay, Sargon of Akkad, and Benjamin Boyce. Is that his last?
I don't know who he is. I know the other two.
But hang on, I'm looking it up real quick because I can. And Boyce, yep. And the issue is watching it the second time, I'm making careful notes because I'm making timestamps, okay? And I'm writing down their arguments, and their arguments were quite interesting with relation to their presentation of what is occurring, what they're interested in the context of this problem that we're all engaged in at the moment. And I'm like, I'm doing the sciencing of it as it's going through, and they're right on track, but they appear to be interested in a philosophical response exclusively.
Yeah, philosophy is the bridge between science and religion, and so that's why it failed.
You know what's interesting? So they're trying to repair the bridge.
Yeah, well, I mean, they are, except that one of the things I thought we could do is, I wanted to go through and agree with them and whatever, but
Yes.
I could actually go through and just point out the errors they're making.
Well, I think we do both.
Okay.
Now, but and I'm making my notes, so I'm only halfway through like of the thing right now or something, and I'm just making notes because but we have to cut. So, do you want to cut it out so there's a video clip interjected?
What I actually think the answer, the way to do it is to just do the art, just watch it together, comment on it, and then cut out what's irrelevant. Because cutting out the points they make in advance,
Okay.
right, that seems to be quite, because they talk a lot of nonsense and they're like you and I do, right? I mean, they're just
right.
nonsense. But saying, okay, well, this is something, we do our coffee cup thing, and this is
Oh, okay.
something a clip we want to say, that then the rest of it can be cut out. I think that would be easiest for us.
Yeah.
The harder thing for us is to go through and pull out, is to watch it together. It still ends up being the same fucking thing. Watch it together, pull out the points. Yeah, it's not gonna make any difference. We have to watch it together and pull it out, because otherwise I don't know what you're seeing and you don't know what I'm seeing. You know what I mean? We don't know
Right. I got you.
what's going on. So I thought we might just go through it together. There's parts you can skip ahead, just skip ahead 5 seconds, this and that and whatever. And I thought we would do that, but it became really obvious to me what errors they're making, and they're the errors you're pointing out there. They're the errors that we consider, that we in our field, true science, attribute to philosophy, and that's number one. The second thing is where they fear to tread. Right, they fear to tread on the Lindsay does in particular, and I don't have a problem.
On what aspect?
He just will. He either will deny the origins of these origins and causes of these problems, or he'll avoid them to pursue his self-interest the way, let's say, Peterson avoids them.
I see.
And we're in the law, we don't get to avoid, right? I mean, they get to avoid because they're trying to sell. The law doesn't sell; it just decides, right? And
right. And I was noticing that they're talking about these things because Sargon was asking, he was talking about decidability and judgment, and then he asked the question, why do we act? I'm like, wow, he's right on the money of biological understanding for, scientific understanding. He's approaching it like he's touching it. I see him hit the pole, and it's like it's interesting. So I don't think the third rail is going to kill anybody.
Well, I mean, the third rail is that the fundamental problem of theology, philosophy, and science to date has been to attempt, is essentially the male, right? They take a male point of view, which is useful, but the problem we're incurring is that the rise of the female point of view into the political from the familial. Yes. And so since they're not looking at those two problems, they're not able to disambiguate whatever it is they're looking at. And so
well, right now, that's what, so James called it miasma.
Yes.
In the Enlightenment, and so they're suffering from it in a similar fashion.
Correct. They don't realize that they think they're solving but they're still inside the problem. Where the problem is biological and computational, right? I mean, it's a continuous, evolutionary computation, right? So and they can't get out of the paradigm themselves. And so they keep using these. One of the other paradigms they use is, of course, they use the paradigm from philosophy that we are in control and positively producing philosophy rather than discovering an opportunity or a harm and justifying our way out of it. And so, it's not they seem to think that the history is full of thinkers. The third thing they do is that they're both reading the same nonsense. In other words, I don't mean that in a it's like theologians read theology, philosophers read essays, and scientists look at the fucking data, right? And the difference is how much loading, framing, and crap is in there, distorting you. So just like they're stuck in the Enlightenment paradigm of they're stuck in the masculine paradigm, they're stuck in the paradigm of positiva, which is right? So they're stuck in the three in a sequence of paradigms that are all three false, and they're profound in the fact that that's the root of the problem, is that they're trying to find in a justificationary pathway like man has always, which makes sense because we arose out of this discourse rose out of moral discourse, which tended to be male, which tended to be reconciliation of differences toward an objective end, right? I mean, deciding. So it's a very justificationary system. It's like, even in justification, it's like, well, I didn't do harm because these, this, and this, that's justification. Or yes. I did good because I intended good, because I did this, therefore I'm forgivable. So
rationalization.
So justification. Well, I mean, it is, but I mean, it's not wrong to explain, because that's what explaining is. It's justificationary. That's what we try to justify an observation or a will or a position or a frame or an episode. So the problem is that they're stuck in this paradigm that's the fucking inverse of what it should be, right? Which is what survives. Well, the problem is when you say what you're justifying, you don't need much knowledge to justify. You only need to explain your point of view or another's point of view, or point of view that you understand within this paradigm. But the problem with falsification is you've got to know everything in order to falsify it. And the knowledge requirement for falsification is vast, right? It's far beyond what you need to the information you need to form a justification.
Right.
So the question is, have we ever been in the position before 1890 to do this, or certainly before 2010? No, 2010 we know enough that there's nothing left, right? I mean, it's just we're there where we understand the first principles of the universe, and if we can't construct it, well, I mean, they've been reading literature. Literature is Plato, right?
Yeah.
Lindsay went off on Hegel for bringing in. So he just rewrote Plato, and I'm like, well, you're in the same fucking trap, because that's literature, that's not science. And we do science, and science says that the reason you're as wrong as the theologians are wrong is because you're trying to solve a problem of greater precision or resolution than the methodology you have allows, because of the three categorical errors I just explained in your methodology, which is philosophy. And it's the reason philosophy did fail. It's the reason philosophy did more harm than good. And if we look at history, I mean, it's what we call natural philosophy, or the Aristotelian side, not the Platonic side, that survived. I mean, they say all of Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Yeah, that's why it's all fucking wrong. Whereas all Western science is a footnote.
Wait, they talked about it. It was Sargon of Akkad, I believe, said it. It was he described the ideology as an advanced technology, right? And he's talking in it, and it's like, that's what it is. But they're attempting to generate another technology using their philosophy for the purpose of modulating the social experience or something like that.
Right. So fundamentally, here's the other error, right? It's democratic, right? You're trying to via positively sell people on something. You don't sell criminals, which is what's going on. You don't sell criminals on not being criminals. you force criminals not. There's another. So that's the next error they're making. You don't sell criminals
they
and
were
not make criminals.
No,
And
I
when the
don't.
majority of the population turns out to be
Because
criminal,
this is no. So this is interesting because the question came up about 1 hour and 6 minutes in. Sargon of Akkad was talking about decidability and judgment. He's like, look, you don't throw all the throw all the Jews in the ovens because you calculated that they're problematic and you can rationally prove it. It's like you pick criminals for their behaviors and you punish them for specific problems that they performed individually.
yes.
And we agree. So
Yeah.
he's right. He's right on the money. He's got it. He's figured it out, but he's trying to philosophize it.
I don't think no philosophy is a choice question, right? So we could say, well, I mean, so here's the difference, right? You could say, well, their group evolutionary strategy is fucking evil, right? So it's like, so their group evolutionary strategy is feminine. What do you throw all the women in ovens? Then what do they fucking do? Right? I mean, it's just doesn't.
Bad plan.
Well, it just doesn't make any goddamn sense. And so the same thing. You throw all the Jews in the oven. Well, why? I mean, I got plenty of friends that are Jews, and I have plenty of other intellectuals I follow who are Jewish, and yeah, they have a feminine bias to their thinking, which
Right.
keeps them in the Jewish paradigm. But that's well, I mean, my family's been conquering people for like at least the past 1,500 years, right? That we have written records.
It's just
So
their job.
it's just what you do. I mean, so I mean, do I, who do you blame, for these things? What you do is you say, okay, well, that looks like it turns out bad.
So your family has desisted now.
Yeah, so we're like, okay. So I'm like, okay, well, I mean, why there's no real, there's no real problem here that needs to be, we don't need to do that again, right? Well, I mean, the same thing for the Jews, the same thing for women is you don't need to do that again because it turns out that that's actually criminal. Well, you may think it's good or make it work for you, but that's not in the sense that it isn't hostile to other people and what makes them retaliate. So we're in the process of retaliating, but we have to learn how to retaliate. Well, do we retaliate by putting all women and all Jews in the ovens? No. We just say this is a behavior that's criminal that happens to be in an instinct you follow, just like my family's instinct is to go kill them all and let God sort it out later. It's the same thing. You just change the behavior. So that way, that's what the law does. Law is a via negative programming language for populations that prevent the bads leaving open all possible goods, rather than a via positiva persuasive language that tries to convince people what's good when frankly there's a much lower limit to what you can convince people is good if they're actually involved in this criminal activity already.
That's
which
right.
most of them are. We've
Yes.
essentially women invented, or women evolved is the right answer, organized sedition. Jews invented organized crime as a means of sedition. And so those things were advantage to weak groups, right? Women being weaker, Jews being weaker, right? And we're sitting there like trying to figure out why they do these things. Well, the problem is we're not attuned to the criminality. We haven't become sensitive to the criminality of female sedition.
It's like in the legal blind spot.
It's legal blind spot for the reasons we've said. Trifunctionalism leaves open anything that isn't in the law, right? Prohibited in the law. So, right, because we're not telling people what to do, we're telling people what they can't do. And otherwise, you're sovereign because we want you to be sovereign because that means you can become a freeman and we don't have to pay the cost of keeping you as a slave or serf, right? What's your freemen are cheaper and citizens are cheaper because freemen are not a burden on you as a cost and citizens are an asset to be used in self-defense. So I mean, it's why slavery eventually was going away, is because consumers are cheaper and easier to manage than slaves, right? I mean, slaves were expensive. I mean, we
Yes.
forget that they're the equivalent of buying a luxury car, right? In history, or expensive luxury car, right? They cost many, they cost usually a year worth of salary or of income for somebody who had money, right? So it's just what are we trying to work towards here? We're working towards the errors that are endemic in their reasoning are errors that are endemic in the Enlightenment that they think they're criticizing, but they're also endemic in all of philosophical history, all the way back to Plato.
Philosophical response to the problem is always going to be via positiva, and it's going to fail to get rid of much that is harmful.
Right. So this is the argument. This is the simple reductive argument. Why does philosophy exist? Because the middle class was powerless and had to make beggings. That's what philosophy is. Right. If you're an aristocracy, you just practically manage. Right. And the thing in the West, you practically manage the fact that you need professional warriors that are very expensive.
Yes.
In order for our small numbers to be able to fight, which it turns out that that's the optimum way of, basically special forces are the optimum way of building armies, and OODA loop, which is our strategy, which is hyper adaptation through the demand for initiative. In other words,
right.
You see, you are required to. Everybody's required to exploit initiative, right? It was the OODA loop. So once you have that military, then the aristocracy's in the position where nobody has authority. They're basically a subchapter S corporation with shareholders, right? And then what happens is you develop this everything of your society, which is democracy, rule of law, and all the crap, is just a derivation of the necessity of the military structure of defending the population, given that we're a small population on the edge of the Bronze Age, lacking the concentration of river valleys that can be used to exploit a peasantry or a slave population. So you're just there, and then these guys come along, and so what is philosophy? Philosophy is a middle class bitching and whining.
That's right. So it's a as opposed to the church, which is lower class bitching.
Exactly. That's all it is, right? It's just bitching. So it's like, okay, wait, glorified. It's
right.
It's just glorified bitching, right? I mean,
okay.
So
the problem is, it's like the issue is they're trying to update it and become the new glorified bitches.
Right, which is okay, because there's an organized, rational means of bitching is useful, because then the aristocracy can say, oh shit, there's a good fucking idea here, right? Or they'll say, we got to actually get this under control because they're right, and we're going to get our asses handed to us, so we better make a change. It's not a bad way of theology bubbling up from the peasantry, which is the Marxist thing, or a philosophy bubbling up from the middle class. It's not a bad thing. I mean, it's just that you got to realize it's coping, right? Philosophy is coping for the fact that you're not in power, and you're begging for an alteration to the system of power.
I see.
So whereas the aristocracy doesn't beg, it's like doing business. Right. I mean, it's just like, I got enough guys, I got enough money, I can steal enough food to get through 4 years. So, I can make this shit happen.
All systems are go.
It's just engineering. Right. Now, the only reason the monarchies or the aristocracies, I mean, you don't see too many of them using philosophy, right? I mean, it's
not useful for them.
It's not useful. What you do is you have it's an informal court of appeals that the philosophers use to bring to the aristocracy, the people who manage. So the problem we have is we've let people, which you call credentialists correctly, we've let people that are essentially pseudoscientists, which are the next level of philosophers, into bureaucracy instead of the military and industrial complex running the aristocracy. And so it's just what you see that it's just like, well, why is the grammar of theology different from the grammar of philosophy, different from the grammar of law? Well, it's because you're trying to rally three classes of people, right? When you're talking about law, you're talking about fucking just realistic shit, right? I mean, I got to hold the territory. I need this many guys. I have to have this much alliance. I have to buy these alliances. I have to buy these alliances. I have to equip these soldiers, right? And I've got to find some. I've got to have somebody administer these peasants, and it's just a business problem.
Yes.
Right. And so that's how they talk about it. So what they do is they put themselves around them, philosophers and theologians, to use the class languages or class grammars against them. Well, theology, weak people have theologies. They claim gods are on their side, right? The not so weak people, but the people with capacity, they have reason on their side, and the state has might on its side. I mean, it's just that's it. The thing is, which one has which responsibility? The state's actually got the hard responsibility, right? I mean, because a failure of a state is really fucking bad. Failure of an economy, well, that can ebb and flow. Failure of the peasantry, yeah, people are going to starve, but they'll rebreed, right? But I mean, when you have a failure of the state, right, the aristocracy, basically everybody dies and gets everything stolen. I mean, that's just
and then Martin Armstrong digs up your hoard and counts your coins later.
Yes. So what I notice is that is the sort of errors these guys are making are they're common middle class errors, and it's the same. They have a similar problem to the one we have. I can only do the science. It's not persuasive, and it's just engineering, right? I mean, this is just.
I think what you're going to say is they're going to be too shy to talk about the science.
Well, I think they are because they're too afraid of the priesthood, right? Because the priesthood has larger numbers, and so there's a small number of us who are engineers. There's a large number of scientists. There's a larger number of people who are philosophers because it's more accessible. Literature is more accessible than all these grammars of calculation and computation, right? And then you have people at the bottom who are spiritually or emotionally driven within their paradigm, and there's way more of them. So I mean, it's just a pyramid of how does stuff work downhill? And the answer is it doesn't appear to work downhill very well at all, unless it's enforced at the top and propagates downward.
Yes.
No, religion succeeds by sedition over time. Philosophy succeeds by promoting an opportunity in time. And the state or or law succeeds by implementing something that takes effect over time. And so it's very effective. So these are just different ways of moving larger numbers of populations. I mean, it's just different kinds of levers, right, for moving people given what they are. I mean, you don't have to, you can be a kid and understand moral theology, right? I mean, it's not that rocket science. You need a little bit of skill to know, to be able to engage in philosophy. And these guys are not they're popular philosophers. They're not professional philosophers by any means, but
right.
They're not incompetent, right? And then you got people up in the sciences, but we even know, God forbid, you and I talk about this all the time, is that sciences aren't evenly distributed with competency. It's a logarithmic distribution, right? There's a very few people who are competent, and most of the people in the sciences are not. And so, or they're not sufficiently competent that they can opine in anything other than the test that they ran, right? I mean, they're just very little, they're not generalizable. There's very few people that are generalizable. And what we do, of course, is the generalization of all the sciences, and right,
The most generalizations in
possible.
a very specific fashion, which is
Right.
quite a strange
Well,
conundrum there to
we're,
even.
we're computationalists, right? It's either computable or it's not, and there's no root. And the problem is that is the highest. I mean, in the spectrum of auto association, daydreaming, thinking, reasoning, logicking, calculating, computing, we're at the end point of the fucking system, right? There's nowhere else to go now.
Needle.
What?
Yeah, the point of the needle.
We're at so there's nowhere else to go after what we've done. All you can do is continue to accumulate knowledge, and given that we know the first principle of the universe, all you're going to do is innovate an application, not in discovery. Well, that's the wrong word. Not in discovery of first principles.
Okay.
You know the first principle. There's only one, right? So everything's built from that one first principle, and we can see all the we can see the sex is the difference between, is the equivalent of the difference between arithmetic and mathematics is the revolution of sex, right? And cooperation is the difference between mathematics and analysis. I mean, it's just, these are demarcation problems in the similar demarcation problems by analogy, is that you're all of a sudden, wow, that's a lot more dimensions we can handle here. So, our work is the endpoint. The problem is we're a novel endpoint that causes reform all the way back through law into philosophy, law and sciences back into.
Yeah.
I think I might have just talked myself into saying what there's something more than science behind what we're doing. But then to back into philosophy, then to back into theology. And I'm like, okay, well, the endpoint, that's the spectrum. You have wisdom and you have computation. And that's just the spectrum. So what precision is your tool useful for? Well, I'm going to tell you what, when it comes down to, I don't know what to fucking do. And the moral thing is going to be the Christian thing. And in this case, that's what I'm going to do is whatever. Well, that's the degree of precision I can use for the question at hand. The problem for these guys is the guys we're talking about, Carl, and which they aren't, remember, these are not professional. These are talented people, but they're popular philosophers, right?
Yes.
Is that the tool that they're using is of insufficient precision to solve the question, the problem they're trying to solve, because they're still in the paradigm they're criticizing, and they're not aware that there's another paradigm, which is
right. That's why I think that the our commentary will be useful. The discussion about them while they're doing their discourse, because they're touching the thing and bouncing back into this imprecision and bouncing around the target that they're attempting to ascertain the subject of.
Yep.
And but they're hitting a lot of good points, and it's like,
well, it's because they're so close, right? They're not. It's like you're talking about errors in precision, not errors in direction.
Yes.
Right. So their direction is correct, but their precision isn't there. Well, the question then is, if you lack the precision, then you can't reduce it to law. Whereas we can reduce it to law because we have sufficient precision to reduce it to law, and not just command law, but
right.
Law. They can reduce to strictly constructed law.
No, that's why I got excited about it, because they're close enough that my take on it will be this: is that if we provide the commentary while we watch their stuff and provide it to them via as a conversation, as if we were interjecting our comments in between their comments, they will be able to understand the import.
Yes.
I don't see that being a problem, because they're sharp guys and they're close enough.
Okay, so I'm trying to handle their objections in my head, right? What objections would they raise? Well, first of all, I think it's harder to understand. I think, given the experience we've both had, is it's harder to understand than what we do than we think. If you don't have basic knowledge of the grammars, right, it becomes very difficult to understand that a grammar is a paradigm with X dimensions in it, right? And that the difference between the grammars is what dimensions are included and not, right? And so I think without knowing that, it becomes very hard. And then
Yeah.
without knowing ternary logic and trifunctionalism, it becomes very hard to get out of this universalist paradigm that they're in, which is the
All right.
point.
They think they're not in it, or they're trying to get out of it.
They're trying to get out of it, they just don't know how.
So it's like, but this is a useful comment, and they will be able to understand this.
You think so?
Because it's like this. He's a mathematician.
Yeah, he's a mathematician, but how do I say this? Mathematics is a logic, a language.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I can be very good in studying Spanish or Italian or French and not understand language itself.
Yes.
Right. And so I think that's the problem. I wouldn't say that he's a mathematician in the sense that he understands, like I do, the foundations of mathematics as, you know, as, and I find very few mathematicians, almost none of them. And the ones that do say, well, that's not actually doing math. That's the science of what math is.
Yes.
And mathematicians do math.
Yes.
Don't study what science is. Just like people who speak French don't do language, they do French, right? I mean, it's the same problem. And so how would I do this in this language is different from what is the difference between what is the origin of all languages and what is the difference between languages?
Yes.
French is a great example because there's a lot of feminine dimension, like the slider for feminine, and French is there, right? It's the slider for aesthetics, and Italian is there, right? The slider for psychology is in German, and the slider for testimony is in English, right? I mean, these are all variations in dimension, which means that these are all good at biasing or increasing
Right.
weight of one dimension or another, or
Mm-hmm.
one set of dimensions or another. So you think this would be good? I think this would be good.
I think it will be excellent.
Do you want to roll? You want to get more coffee and roll into it? Is that what you want to do?
That would be fine. That would be great.
All right. So let me pause here. Well, I'm having a little crisis here. There we go. All right.
Right.
Can you see the three of them plus the two of
Yes.
us?
Yes.
All right. So we're going to go through and go through this video, at least some of it, on the ends of liberalism with Carl Benjamin and James Lindsay. The link I'll keep in the bottom. And
It's
so,
from Benjamin Boyce, by the way.
yes, I don't know him. I don't know anything about him. I don't know who he is. He's got some subscribers, so he's.
Yes.
So we're gonna go back to the beginning, and we're just gonna listen in. And Brad, how are you gonna tell me when to pause when you want to say something?
I'll just wave my coffee cup.
Okay, so, or just say something, right?
Oh, there you go. I'll make a noise.
So I'm gonna hit play about a minute in.
Over 200 years ago, when Benjamin sent me homework last night to read one of your articles, and I may actually do a podcast based on the article at some point.
Which one was that?
Should I do it at normal speed or should I speed it
A
up?
1.5 is fine.
Let's try that.
Which one is it, Benjamin? It's your five flaws with liberal philosophy.
Oh, the false assumptions. Yeah.
Yes, the 5 false assumptions. I think that's a very important piece, honestly. So yeah,
I'm working on a follow-up to that, actually, because I've identified at least 4 more false assumptions in liberalism, which unfortunately it's one of the problems of it. It's just kind of irreconcilable for the philosophy. I mean, I'm not happy to say that, you know.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think about these things a lot because this was philosophy that was hashed out over 200 years ago.
Yeah.
When, I mean, we get in a lot of trouble for saying this because there's a lot of old wisdom and things, but frankly, people didn't know what the hell was going on. And liberalism falls out of the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is this sprawling, messy kind of quest of discovery. And, you know, the dawning of the scientific revolution is kind of beginning, but science doesn't mature until the early 20th century, certainly until at least electromagnetism is tamed, which is early 20th century. Quantum mechanics throws a wrench into the whole thing later, but you have this kind of unfolding of ideas where people are making sort of stabs in the dark, and there's this kind of, I don't know, almost miasma of deep philosophical thought mixed in with literal mysticism, mixed in with religion, and trying to cut apart from these things all at once, where people, again, like, you know, with the 5 false assumptions essay that you wrote, you talk again and again about this root of this kind of being this image of the state of nature, which is of course just crap. No such thing ever existed. No such thing applies whatsoever. Again, if you
I don't think I'll admit that it's probably not true as well.
This is
Right,
good.
it's even funnier.
Yeah, why base anything on something you probably think is not true? Why do that?
Because humans. I mean, what are you gonna do?
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, it's just fantastic to look at this, because my opinion, and maybe you agree with me, and maybe you don't agree with me, and maybe you hope I'm right, is that there is, if we might lift language from Karl Marx just for the hell of it, that there's a rational kernel in this mystical shell that can be pulled out and updated for the 21st century.
Curt,
I think that these assumptions poke at something true and valuable. I know that you have
Stop
identified yourself, and I identify myself as classically
Stop
liberal in many regards. I don't know if that still holds true for sure, but
what I want you to make a comment on is what he called the miasma of thought, of the Enlightenment. As the scientific coalescence was occurring in the early part of the industrial development of the civilization.
Yeah, I don't know. How is he using that term?
He used miasma. And it's like, there's like and I was describing it, and I was thinking about it. It inspired me to think of it's like the language was developing as well as the thought was developing, which was the differentiation of scientific thinking from magical thinking and religious thinking.
Right. So we've always had trifunctional thinking in the West, which is supernatural, right, for the priestly, feminine, rational philosophical for the middle class, and legal pragmatic for the upper class. We've always had these three. They're endemic, and it's why we have the three systems. And so what's happening in the Enlightenment is the reordering of the priority. In the ancient world, and we had the legal empirical first, the pragmatism of the state second, and the third would be the religion, which was a low priority. And so in any civilization, the order between state, law, and faith, the foundational order, which is a dependence hierarchy, means that the first is the most influential, the second less so, and the third less so. And in the West, the religion existed and people practice it, but it was the weakest of the three institutions. So what happens in the Middle East is, because it's tribal, religion allows for localized control instead of centralized control. And religion allowed the Middle East to defeat the corruption of the chieftains, at least certainly Islam did. And so they have think of it as the religion is a very imprecise distributed system for people who have very limited abilities and responsibilities. Law, or the middle class method, is something with people who have cooperative responsibilities, usually commerce and trade and this kind of stuff. And then aristocratic or state rule is really just purely pragmatic. It's how do we hold on, defend this territory and keep the order that we have. So these things exist. So it's happening in the beginning in 1200, when the it really begins earlier than that, because as soon as, despite the Christian destruction of ancient wisdom, and the temples and the killing the philosophers and burning their books, the Christian thing maintain the state still exists, and the law still exists, because the church is never powerful enough. And the church is never powerful enough because it's captured by the nobility. In other words, the nobility now owns the churches, right? Which are basically corporations that hold assets on behalf of noble families, and then they maintain the peasantry, right? So the church is basically a corporation. So once that happens, now you have an inverse of what is apparently the priority of religion, because religion is the means by which we govern the people rather cheaply, versus previously as serfs or slaves, how you govern the people expensively. So it turns out to be a pretty good method when you're getting into the poorer parts of Europe, right? I mean, they have a cheaper means of administration. And so what happens then is that by 1200, what's happened is the Islam has gone full fundamentalism, and all the scholars are fleeing Islam. They come back into the West, and they bring with them what we consider as the Greco-Roman literature. And this gets into Italy, then into Germany, then into the north, and especially in England. And by 1200, we have the reaction, which we think of as the beginning of the conversion of the beginning of the reversal of peasant superstition into middle class, the middle class law. And so this is what I'm doing a great disservice to in a very complex process in order to try to satisfy a minimum understanding. And that's that. And so what's happening is this disruption is causing a conflict, a trifunctional conflict between theology, philosophy, and law. And in philosophy, it's causing a conflict between philosophy itself and natural philosophy. And that's because natural philosophy is science, and science is basically the means of the application of our system of law to things that aren't necessarily conflicts over property, but conflicts over ideas. So what's happening is this, I don't know why he calls it miasma. I call it confusion, right?
Yeah.
They're just trying to work it out, and they're doing the best they can. So further on, in this clip, he'll list people like Bacon and Newton, who are like, are they theologians? Are they philosophers? Or are they natural philosophers? Well, that's like saying to me, you and me, are you a rule of law guy, a Christian, or a scientist? Well, I'm all fucking three. I mean, what's that mean? It's just, what's the priority of these things? And what's happening is during this process, they're trying to figure out what priority is going to reign. Is it going to be English empiricism? Is it going to be German rationalism, French moralism, or are they going to go back to theology, Christian theology? And this competition is just doing what competitions do under trifunctionalism, trying to figure the hell out what works. So, I mean, if that's what you wanted me to answer, that's what I did.
Yeah, that's what I think, and it's good.
So the only thing that we should we'll get into later, is once you understand those paradigms, like the theology, philosophy, natural philosophy, and law, right? You start realizing that there's a grammar or a logic behind each one of those things, and what's in each logic includes or excludes different dimensions of measure. So it's going to be clear that they don't have that tool available to them, so they can't disambiguate what they're seeing. It sounds all the same to them, but it's actually not. It's a competition between different logics, and each logic is a means of decidability, and these means of decidability are fighting for control as the priority of faith decreases. the rise of trading because the rate of trade increases, and as the scope of trade increases, the scope of government increases, and
Yes.
so as such the scope of law increases. So you have the problem of law is basically a system of measurement that allows cooperation at different scales, and I don't think they quite get there. They're still thinking in this sort of via positiva. In other words, they're trapped. They're criticizing the Enlightenment. They don't realize they're talking about it from within the same structure.
Right.
With your desire not for those things not to be the case, or that I feel like
guess I would
there's
a post-liberal at this point. It's not that I don't owe anything to the legacy of liberalism. I feel that it's time to figure out what was true and what was not, and then what's keep and what to lose.
So in that sense, I don't know that our project is wholly different, except that what I would rather do is put the truth of those insights that are based on incorrect assumptions on firmer ground and update them for the 21st century and the circumstances we find ourselves in.
But that's something we can definitely discuss. Yeah, definitely something we can discuss.
Where would one begin? Because both of you guys have attacked very thoroughly in your own ways progressivism, and then moving on to, as both of you, I've watched you guys develop your critiques. You go deeper and deeper and deeper. And so where do we start if we just say, okay, we know that something's wrong. Society's fragmenting at the same time, power's congealing in a way that doesn't seem to be good. And we want to have some sort of philosophy or some sort of philosophical grounding from which to proceed towards organizing society.
Okay, so that's the problem, right? Is that they want a philosophical foundation, not a scientific one. So the question is, if you don't have a scientific one, how do you know your philosophical one is a nonsense, right? Or
Right. So, but they're looking for. Carl asked to. He said he's interested in detecting the errors of liberalism and remove them, for the updating the philosophy. And the issue is you need to have a method of decidability in order to determine what is factual and what is false.
yes.
And that's okay. They're on the right track.
Well, I think Carl's, I mean, they're just doing different things. I would say Carl's more right in his understanding of what to do. And James is more detailed in what the left is doing wrong.
That's, I think, an accurate assessment.
Right. So I don't think that's really a problem. The fundamental issue here is a couple of incentives are present, right? Tendency of thinking in philosophical terms is a problem. The fact that learning cognitive science, linguistics, which is I view as computation, economics, which is via positive cooperation, law, which is via negativa limits. Those disciplines themselves, prior to our work, were not wholly scientific, and so it's not easy for them to say, okay, well, now the sciences are sufficiently complete and coherent that we can develop a philosophy which is a positive expression, right? That's the difference of philosophy. It's a positive narrative justification of the good. And I think that's what they mean, which is that's what they're searching for. Right? But the problem is that you can specialize in criticizing the enemy, right? But if you don't know what true is, which I think is Carl is sort of hinting at here, then you can't actually solve the problem because the tool you're using to solve it lacks sufficient precision. So not only are they talking in philosophy, which is a via positiva, not only are they talking in philosophy that is a universalist, not only are they talking in a philosophy that is still essentially masculine, right, which is one-sided, when the actual problem is the equilibrium between the two sexes and resulting in cooperation. Then you're not, they're sort of trapped in this little bubble, right, that they aren't aware of. So does that, I'm watching your face, so
Yeah, I think that covers it.
I changed the depth I was going to go into there in reaction to you, but so this universalist or singularity frame, rather than trying to understand the science of what produces the decidability regardless of frame, which is the via negativa, is something they just aren't aware of. I usually view it as I could probably have a conversation with Carl about anything and it would be useful. I don't know, James is pretty rigid in how he's approaching his understanding. It doesn't mean he's wrong. It's just that he's got a narrow focus on a particular problem, and he's afraid, for justifiable reasons, just as most people are, like Peterson certainly is. He's sufficiently afraid of what the truth is, the origin is, that he's trying to stay out of that field, when that field is the only way to get to the actual. In other words, it's what I do, right? I'm like, if it's important enough to lie about, there's a truth you're obscuring, right? So I look at the world differently. I'm like, I want to know the truth behind every taboo, because the truth behind all those taboos is the shit we're lying about. So what is it we're lying about and why? And some things are kind of silly, like the Hindu prohibition on cows. I mean, it's just a capital problem, right? I mean, people think the Jewish thing on pork has to do with trichinosis, and it doesn't. It's an archaic bit of social engineering because of the class structure. I mean, pigs were an underclass farm animal, right? So it has to do with that kind of stuff. It has nothing to do with trichinosis. So it's a purity claim. So we all have stupid ideas, right, that float around. And anyway, so let's get back to their thing here, and I'll let's see if they give us a more precise opportunity to increase precision a bit.
Yeah.
So I'm seeing the situation that we're in, and you and I spoke about this, I think, after we ended the stream last time, Benjamin, where we talked about the idea of that what we're dealing with, whether we call it communism or neo-communism or Marxism or this kind of legacy of Marxism or woke or the kind of weird fascist thing that they built at the World Economic Forum, United Nations, out of all of this, and are applying it to us. I call it a parasite, a liberal parasite. And I think that a lot of the post-liberal movement thinks that this is the culmination of liberalism, whereas I think it is a parasite that is latched onto the side of liberal philosophy and societal organization, and
Yes,
basically taking
correct.
control of the ship. It's like that deal that went viral the other day with the parasites. It has no body left. It's just the out.
We left the hole in our Constitution, left an opportunity for the parasites to distribute itself on top of liberalism, right? And that now will he answer the question of what that parasite is, its cause, origins, and methodologies? I don't know. I didn't think so, but then he keeps, every month that goes by, he moves a little closer, and I get a little more hope. But he's doing a great job. So
the outer carapace of the beetle walking around literally like a janky beetle, but there's no body. Like the thing's not even just dead. It doesn't even have a body anymore. It's been eaten literally apart from the inside. And I feel like that we have a parasite on liberalism rather than a coming to fruit of what liberalism was always intended or likely to go to. And so when I think about that, to switch metaphors, which I know is always a dangerous thing to do, to maybe more of like a garden. When does your garden get taken over by weeds? It doesn't get taken over by weeds when the plant life, for example, is healthy and well tended. And so that's kind of, in my opinion, getting this basic philosophy right. If we want to get our basic substrate to where it excludes the possibility of the parasite being able to latch on. But the problem is the parasite's already latched on. Its fangs are deep inside. It's already drained most of the blood out of society. It's drinking what it can now very quickly of what's left.
this is what I love about him. When he goes on these via negativa rants, they fucking kill me, right? I mean, every time it just warms. I get this chuckle listening to him because I realize the catharsis that's happening. And I was like, you and I talk about this all the time. I don't know how he does that, right? How
I don't either, man.
he
It's
holds
just
his
got to
nose
be
while
rough.
he's reading all that crap. And this is what comes out is the catharsis. And I just think every time he goes on one of these rants, it just gives me chuckles. Not only because what he's saying is funny, but because I'm empathizing with the release he's getting out of doing it.
And so we actually also have to kill the parasite. So what I see is we've got this weird techno, transhumanist future awful thing happening, being foisted on us by the exploitation of being able to get around the kind of liberal government principles by using the corporate sector to circumvent most of the protections that are supposed to be there. So we get this kind of monstrosity that has to be destroyed. I think that every sane person who wants freedom in the future, whether we're liberal, conservative, post-liberal, whatever, has to focus on destroying that, which includes the woke ideology. But we also have to figure out how to get this fundamental philosophical substrate right in order to make sure that we don't easily get reinfected, or in fact, just like I hear a lot about like creating parallel structures, parallel economy, parallel.
Stop that.
Yeah, that's where he's got wrong.
So he just may express that we get the philosophical substrate right, and we fixed it, and we kill the parasite. And you got to identify the parasite more clearly. You got to change the law, not the philosophy.
That's right.
The
Philosophy will
follow.
emerge from the law, right? And that's one of the things you and I talk about, that I think that I see all the other guys in the AI spectrum getting there, and these guys don't, which is that there's a problem in the 1800s, right? Where I call it the Babbage failure, but I mean, that's just a point of demarcation.
Yeah.
All this nonsense is continuing going on. As soon as you get large enough scale, you have to work in eliminative knowledge, not justificationary knowledge. So,
you know what knowledge?
Eliminative, right? So it's the sculpt out of clay, which you think you're designing by intent, right? And the via negativa is removing the stone around and exposing the image underneath. Well, so what we do is via negativa. And what he keeps looking for is a philosophy, which is a via positiva. But the only way to do that at this scale, with this level of precision, is to have the via negativa and then create a via positiva description of it. In other words, how do you the belief that people are positive thinkers rather than justificationists post hoc, it's like is simply a misunderstanding of human nature versus the means by which we attempt to organize, take up advantage of an opportunity or exclude a cost. And so this problem is they have to have the science in order to make the law, in order to create a via positiva, which is less precise, right? But that explains the law, that justifies the law. In other words, puts in a moral frame that law which exists, but that law is eliminative, it's prohibitive, it's exclusionary, right? And so what we do is we look for what is the fundamental principle. In other words, how do people engage in thefts, crimes, seditions, whatever? And we say, okay, this is how you eliminate all those. But that's just elimination. That's not saying what to do. That the field of to do is now anything that you don't do, right? So, but the problem is they don't know how to. They don't. Nobody other than us really knows how to eliminate everything scientifically. And what does scientifically mean? From first principles, so that it's not violable, right? There's no way to violate a first principle. That's the whole point.
All right.
All that. I think that's interesting and a bit ambitious and in a kind of fake way. But at the same time, how do you prevent such a thing from being immediately co-opted by the parasite? And that becomes a question. Like, I'm looking at this school choice movement thing happening in the United States, and I'm just like, you guys have done literally zero of the groundwork. This whole thing is going to be a woke visit.
Exactly. If you haven't prohibited by first a construction, in other words, you haven't created a logic of first principles that allows you to falsify anything that's false, then you can't prohibit it. So creating another school structure is just saying, well, we're just gonna make them start over in this case instead, but we haven't outlawed the behavior itself.
Right.
Disaster in 3 years, the whole thing, because you've done none of the groundwork to prevent your alternative structure from getting taken over from the inside. This is a mistake the reactionaries have made throughout the world. The integralist movement in South America made this. They created all these powerful structures. They got their little helicopters. They got rid of the communists. Everybody clapped. And now look at South America. The whole place is going communist full blast and using the apparatuses that they created in order to oppress people. It doesn't work. So we have to. It's not just making a parallel, but we have to also get the philosophy right. And it has to be the philosophy updated in terms of what we've learned. So these 5 false assumptions, or 9, I guess now that Carl's identified, of liberalism have to be addressed. Those problems have to be identified and addressed. The philosophy has to be clarified and updated. We have to figure out what liberalism actually was intending to achieve, therefore clear it up, and then at the same time destroy this beast that's, I mean, I use that in the biblical sense, this beast that's consuming freedom and humanity, not even civilization, screw civilization, it's consuming humanity, and it has to be stopped. So these are the things that I see as our big project, but we've got to also get the philosophy right. The cultural renewal underneath, the cause of whatever human liberty looks like in the 21st century, has to speak into not just what we've learned that shows these 9 errors, but what we also know and what we're dealing with, the tech sector, the idea of a kind of literal ethereal world that we semi-live in through the internet. Space and time are actually.
I'm sorry, I just gotta love this guy some more, right? I just love this guy, right? This is what I fucking love about him. He's like, okay, I'm not gonna create a little pointed argument that sits in a vacuum. You have to remember, he takes the fucking fire hose and he just sprays it on vast categories of everything, and it's that nearly what is it when priests get up there? It's the polemical nature of what he does, just and a fearlessness of it, right? And he's like fire and brimstone preacher, all right,
Right.
in secular philosophical prose, and I mean, I could listen to him spam this stuff all day long, and it just fills me with somewhere between joy and laughter.
Different. We don't need the queer theory for their queer space and time being the only people speaking into that.
Are you suggesting that we create a state of nature thought experiment for the internet, a state of virtuality?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Carl, what's your response to that, or where would you like to focus on?
I think I actually do disagree with James on this. Sorry, James. I hate to
You don't have to be
confrontational
apologetic
about
to disagree with me.
No,
Look,
no, no.
I've got
but
my anti-science aggression mug here for this. I'm ready.
yes, yeah, I'm the leading anti-science activist. I think this probably was an inherent aspect of liberalism, because, and it seems to be the Enlightenment itself is a movement dedicated to the supremacy of reason, and that seems like a rational thing to have in the 17th century when everyone is incredibly prejudiced, things are bad, people are suffering all the time, and the human condition is far worse than what we have now. But the thing is, I've come to the conclusion that ideas are a product of time and place. They don't just exist in the ether to be accessed at any point. They are a product of the human experience. And we are living in a very different world now after 300 years of the supremacy of reason. Mm-hmm. And so much good has been done that we have forgotten what good can be done through ways of life that are not based on reason. Because in fact, much of our daily life is not really based in reason. Most of it is based in habit, in custom, in prejudice. And I don't mean prejudice in the way the left would use it to describe bigotry, but the accrued wisdom of habits is really what we mean by prejudice there. We don't necessarily know. Like, for example, I'm not vaccinated. I don't know anything about vaccines, but I thought I would just be prudent on this and not jump like everyone else. And lo and behold, I'm not worried about having a random heart attack. It wasn't because I had any special knowledge or wisdom or insight. It was because long experience has taught me that when everyone is moving in one direction and you're not allowed to criticize or challenge that, there's something you need to know about this. And that wasn't a product of reason. That was a product of my prejudice. And so it's not that these things aren't valuable. It's not that they don't contain knowledge and wisdom, and it's not that they aren't helpful. The problem is that prior to the Enlightenment, that was the dominant paradigm, and it was oppressive, and it was maintaining social orders that people understood, rightly understood, to be intolerable and should have changed. And it's good that they did. But I think that the pendulum has swung too far now, and it's normal and natural for people who are committed to reason to stigmatize things like prejudices, things like unthinking habits, biases. It's normal for them to do that because that's what's in the way of them achieving what they're trying to attain. But the problem, I think, that lies at the very root of the Enlightenment itself is it can't really stop itself from the way it is constituted in its origins, from admitting that the ultimate goal of the Enlightenment is to free the will from the body. Because ultimately, it is the physical necessity of being a human being that will forever be inhibiting what the will is. And there's a massive...
Yeah, see, that's very French.
What is?
His interpretation.
How,
right?
How so?
Well, the English are just practical. Everything they say, I mean, you read, I mean, one thing to read Locke, but I mean, just read Smith alone. It's purely practical. It's engineering.
Well, I think he's complaining. I think he's complaining about the French introjection of the French.
I want to make sure that's clear, because my view is the Enlightenment isn't. It's a counter-enlightenment. The English have the Enlightenment, and the rest of it is a counter-enlightenment. And the French, in typical French feminine fashion, urinate all over this thing with their ideological nonsense. Whereas the English method is just an outgrowth of Roman Anglo-Saxon ethics and Norman administration as being a purely practical problem of how do we operate in large numbers and provide an escalation path for problems. And the reason is it's not a very positiva. In other words, they don't have utopian ideas about the population. They're just trying to govern profitably for everyone and have the least conflict in the country, because that's what makes the monarchy richest and the nobility richest. It's very simple.
Mhm.
Whereas the minute you get down into France, you've got this Catholic hangover, right? And you get into Italy and you have this low trust hangover. And so you have this, and in Germany, you don't have the low trust problem. You don't necessarily have the Catholic hangover, but you have the Christian duty hangover, right? Which is quite beautiful in German civilization. So I just say, when we're talking about liberalism, I understand that as Anglo empirical rule of law, right? It's a purely practical system. There's nothing ideological about it, other than trying to sell it by the philosophical cast. Whereas the French stuff it's just reinvention of authoritarian Catholic utopianism. And the German is like, well, I don't like either of those. Let's make it Protestant, meaning individual reason. And that's where you get Kant and Hegel and all that. It's like the same thing, Protestant structure of knowledge, which is internal rather than authoritarian. And it's utopian only in the sense that it believes in the individual's capacity to live virtuously, right? Whereas the French is like, we've got to make the environment control it. And so I just view the French, German, Russian, Jewish, the two Jewish revolutions. Now we're still going through the Indian and the Chinese and the South American. This revolution is spreading around the world, and frankly, we're finding out how few people. So basically, the Germanics and the Far East Asians are capable of it, and it's not clear anyone else is. So did I make that sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Conversation to go into about the kind of circular nature of this as well, but I'll try and sidestep that just to save time. We see this, as James points out, very, very honestly. This was probably, I think, one of those insights, James, when I was watching one of your podcasts, and it just clicked for me. You described them as a Gnostic cult, and I was that's exactly right. So I read about Gnosticism when I was studying the Cathars, and I'd never made the connection before, and you were spot on. But that's exactly the problem, isn't it? It's the stigmatization of the material world that is the issue. And then I watched a podcast that Michael Knowles did with a science-based medical student, and he drilled it down at the end to her saying, well, he was like, well, this is your body, then what's you? She's like, well, it's my soul. So, oh my God, okay. So now we have arrived at the Gnostic position where the soul precedes the body. Now, I'm an atheist, so I don't believe that at all. I believe that the mind is a product of the body. And in fact, the mind is not separate from the body. It is a part of the body. And so I think this is where we can properly begin to see where the Enlightenment actually has this fundamental flaw in it, and how we can begin, like I said to James just before we started, I consider myself these days sort of a post-liberal. My instincts are, of course, as they've always been, and I'm still very classically liberal in what I would choose for myself. But as I noted in those articles, there are false assumptions that liberalism is built on. And if you are forced to build an intellectual foundation that is consistent and accurate to reality, which not everyone is, and you could have a mythological foundation, which lots of people do, and that's not necessarily bad either, but that's another conversation, then we have to ascertain what the real situation was, as you point out, James. They were doing their best 300 years ago, but of course there's just so much more that we know now, thanks to the use of reason. So the core thing for me is to actually stitch back together reason and our physical bodies. This is something I think actually needs to happen.
And tradition too.
Well, that's the point.
I think that's a very imprecise statement in the classical liberal or there's the Enlightenment context, but I don't like the way it sounds, but it's correct. Right. I mean,
it sounds correct to me. It's certainly oriented in the right direction.
Yeah. So we said this before, is that I'm listening to these guys because you realize you've listened to more of this than I have. It's mostly, I mean, I've only made it through 15 minutes of this before.
Oh,
For this board. And one thing is they're directionally correct, right? I mean, they're going the right direction, right?
Yes,
Right.
there's no question, but that there's both of them is the alignment of this conversation is in the right direction, right track.
So the problem is precision, and Carl's making that argument right now. The problem is we need a means of measurement, a system of measurement, to be able to eliminate what's evolved out of only using reason
Yes.
or overusing reason. Okay.
Almost everything physical you do is kind of a tradition. It's kind of part of a tradition. Like you get up every morning and you get your breakfast and you don't think, well, you're going to have breakfast. What do I feel like? And, you know, on a Thursday, you might feel like a fry-up or something. I don't know. You know, but you make your breakfast, you don't really think about it. It's just something you do. And this is the habitual patterns of life. This is most of what we do. And it's okay that that is unreasoned. It's okay that most of our life is actually kind of impulsive, as Jonathan Heitz gone through. And we've known as far back as Hume. Actually, most of what we do isn't rationalized. Most of what we do is post hoc rationalization for what we've just done, because habitually we've always done.
Okay. He just said it. Fine. Okay. Yes.
And so the remarriage of these things is an important thing, but what I think that does is actually to destroy the concept of ideology itself, and that's a problem for ideologists. And ideologists are mostly, as far as I can tell, a product of the Enlightenment. I think you could make an argument that Islam is a form of political ideology that came obviously long before. But
what do you mean by ideology?
I would take exception to that ideology is a product of the Enlightenment is not true. Ideology is a product of the counter-Enlightenment of the French, which is how do you motivate large numbers of guys to engage in industrial war? And you
correct. The people who, his name's escaping me right now, I can't pull it up, but the people who've done the work on ideology say it's a product of democracy. Yeah. Right, and that's correct. And so you're just giving a better, more, well, it's a product of democracy because products of democracy of the French method of utopian, the French utopian system.
Oh, it was it's projection of force in mass.
So as a grammar, in other words, as a system of logic, what's different between ideology and philosophy? The difference is philosophy has to be coherent and ideology doesn't. Right? So no, it's important because it's actually the point. The purpose of ideology is to motivate you to act in favor of a political. So, and it can be
inconsistent.
It doesn't have to be consistent with anything except your emotions.
So it's a non-correspondent.
Right. So this is why you get feminisms and ideology. It's not a philosophy. If it's philosophy, it would have to include things that the ideology doesn't. But what is the purpose of ideology? And why did it arise? Well, it arose because it's the means of obtaining power under democratic systems. All right. That's it. Now, you could say conversely, it's the means of justifying power in non-democratic systems. Right.
Yes.
Right. So, but eventually, what we come up with is that you don't need an ology if you have power. Right. It's ologies provide discounts on retention of power. So theology provided a discount on the preservation of power. Now, it also was in the interests of the ordinary people because the reason you need power is scale. Right. So if you scale a polity, which produces a huge discount on trade, you need a system of commensurability everywhere, including what's right, wrong, just, unjust, fair, unfair, etc. But we always think of it as, well, money, weights, measures, and volumes, right? I mean, but the truth is that so ethics and mores are systems of measurement for weighing decisions at different things, just as weight, volume, and count are different measures of different things.
So it's measures of value in the most abstract.
In the most sense, it's always value, right? I mean, there's no point in measuring something if the question isn't comparative value. I'm sorry for being too strict a logician there, but I mean, it's anyway. So sorry. What is you? So the point you were bringing up was
it comes down to human values.
Right, yeah, but except when you say it like that, now it sounds arbitrary. When no, hold on. Go ahead.
It's arbitrary, but we must have a mechanism to measure it.
We have to measure
Every one of them.
and also human values are marginally indifferent.
Wait, but we're going to go. The issue is the precision of language to talk about the values of import. We talk about the morals, and we can have a precise language.
Morals, ethics, right, wrong, true, false, right, testifiable, non-testifiable, true, false, etc. But we get into perceivable, understandable, rational. I mean, we can get into all this.
But the issue is in the context of this conversation is that all of these can be precisely language driven, and we can use language.
Are you saying that we can speak more precisely about what they're saying? Is that what you're saying?
That for the purposes of their conversation,
yes,
that the language can be much more precise.
Yes.
And it can be used as a system of measures for all human values.
Yes. In other words, universal commensurability is possible if you have the sufficient language, and language is all language is system measurement. Well, so if you work from first principles, now you've got, well, I mean, it's universal system of measurement, right? System of measurement. And now you have, and if you speak an operational language under equilibrium, now you've got a universal system of judgment. Well, they don't, they're not logicians, right? That's, that's what I do. I mean, they're popular philosophers, and they're doing a great job of it, honestly, because they're certainly going to reach more people than I am with formal analytic operational logic. I mean, you can't even understand what I'm fucking talking about. So,
theology, like a ruling coherent.
So there are lots of definitions of ideology, and no one seems to be able to nail them down. But a few that I've been working with, one of them comes from critical race theory, actually, which is a set of contested ideas, and the second one is from Oakeshott, where it's the distillation and abstraction of a political tradition that is used in order to justify the seizure of power. And actually, I think that one, combined with the other one, that one is most accurate, because an ideology is essentially programming code for political NPCs, for midwits, to tell them, oh no, if you do this, this, and this, you should get X or Y result.
What?
It's just funny to me. It's programming language for midwits.
It is. What it is. The thing is, midwits never had power before democracy. Right? So they have no meritocracy. There's no merit sufficient for their influence. So now the problem is you've reversed the problem of slave, serf, freeman, citizen, sovereign. And now you've sort of said, okay, you don't have the responsibilities due to demonstrated competency that this class does, but you have the say in political matters. When the answer is, until you've demonstrated via positiva competency, then there's no evidence that anything you think, say, or do should affect positiva in the commons, right? On the other hand, doesn't matter what your capability is, we know what via negativa imposition of costs against your demonstrated interests are. So people need equal protection in the via negativa. In other words, it doesn't matter if you're a child, we have to defend your demonstrated interests, even if those interests are yet capable of producing any surplus, right? We have to invest in your future. But I mean, if we're talking about the ability to make a via positiva statement, the problem is universal enfranchisement. Now, there's rule of law implies, and it implies, we define it as universal application. It applies to everyone equally, right? But that's rule of law. That's commonality, right? That means you're equally defended and insured against harms to you, right? But that's not the same as what the French tried to make a rule of law about. It's like any fucking shit we make up that we can, right? So, whereas in the sense of via positiva, which is concurrency, which is what we do when we vote, we try to find concurrency, is that's a different thing altogether. That says, now I'm competent to say what should be. And except that you have no demonstrated evidence of competency. You have just the opposite.
Well, this would go to Page and Gillen showed this, is that the influence of the general public's opinions no sway in government, no significant impact.
Well, they have no positive impact, sure, but the problem is they don't have negative impact. Right. I mean, this is the purpose of the jury, right? Parliaments, they're juries. They don't say what to do, they judge. Right. So now we've created a population that isn't a freaking jury. It's basically an application of force. Yet our courts no longer protect us.
I'm not done yet. I'm not done. So okay. It goes this. The issue is that the people who do have influence, the wealthy have influence on what goes on in government, and they use democracy as the justification of that process.
Yeah, because the people have no juridical defense.
It's not real democracy. It only is the appearance of democracy.
Okay, so that's twofold. Not only is it not democracy, right, resulting, right, because it involves via positivas the people don't want. It doesn't result in via positivas the public does want.
Yep.
And at the same time, the public is excluded from juridical defense against it. Yes. by the disintermediation of the people from the courts through the legislature, which is they're claiming is democratic equivalent of a court, and it's not. Just the opposite. They have no juridical defense through the parliament, which is what its original meaning was a jury. You know, we're having a parlay. We're going to come to an agreement on something, but all the positivas came out of the state. The state says, I have a positiva here. Will you, the jury, accept it? Right. And then so that was the House of Lords. Oh, we had the House of Commons. All right, we're bringing the House of Commons. Now it's the Parliament, right? That's all people who've demonstrated competency, like business owners or whatever. Now we bring the House of Commons in, and you say, okay, well, do you? This is the state's idea. Will you? Do you agree or not? In other words, will you pay for it or not? That was fine. But the minute we get this Enlightenment shit out of the French, which is
counter-Enlightenment.
It's a counter-Enlightenment, right? I mean, it's actually the counter-Enlightenment, which is now we should be able to make up all sorts of shit. And just because we agree on it, it's okay.
All right.
Makes me insane.
And now, I mean, we know that this just generally isn't true for most ideologies because the world is horrifically complex. But it is the retreat at.
Is that true?
It's not as complex as you just said it is.
Right.
It's actually much simpler than it is.
Yes.
And maybe that will confuse him.
The world is actually quite simple. The problem is, I think, is that precisely for the reasons he's stated, the tendency of the simple world to fall down into the bottom through discovery of truths, right, sciences, whatever, and the tendency of people to develop habits that satisfy what he skipped over, but when we didn't talk about, which is the cost of neural economy.
Yes,
that conflict creates a problem of complexity, right? Because you're trying to now bring sort of truth and habit together in order to figure out, and there's no system of measurement until now that allows people to say, well, that's actually wrong, or actually your habit might be good but habitual, but we need to change it, right? There's not that conflict, but the world turns out to be, quite to our surprise, because you tease me about this all the time, it turns out to be quite simple, right?
It's alarmingly so.
Out of, well, I should say the advance out of this scholarly place into a more real place where we're approaching this sort of more Edmund Burkean position of, yes, I'm a Whig, yes, I'm all these things, but I also think the traditions are important. To kind of marry these things back together, I think is actually the job of post-liberals, because we don't want to lose the good things that liberalism provided for us, but we also don't want those things weaponized against us. And when you're existing purely in the world of theory, actually that's entirely possible, as James and I have both spent a lot of time explaining through critical race theory. It's actually an attack on the liberal view of civil rights that birthed critical race theory and has allowed it to prosper, because the parasite itself knows how we work, and so it can do these things. And so we want to retain the good things that we achieved without opening the door to radical extremism, like the critical race theorists. And we also want to rehabilitate the authentically human dimensions of being a human, because one of the problems of reason is that we're looking at AI at the moment saying, okay, well, it's only a matter of time until this is effectively a human, as far as we can tell, because it's capable of reason. But I think that's the wrong way of looking at it, because the constituency then, if it's a rational being, well, a lot of things could end up being rational, but only one type of thing is a human. And that's the thing I think we need to be concerned about, because we are all humans and the human experience is very rich and very complicated. And I think that we need to bring these things back together. And that means we need to, I think, have a more sentimental view of ourselves, each other, and the sort of connective tissue between each person, that is the relationship that they have with one another, with the place around them, with their own civilization, with their country, any metaphysic that they happen to hold. That I think is what needs to really be thought about, rather than trying to continue on the path of ideology in order to try and defeat the woke virus. I mean, I agree it needs to be defeated, but I think actually it's kind of more advanced technology in that regard, and so it'd be like trying to win the American Civil War with bows and arrows rather than rifles. I don't think you can do it. So I'll leave that.
But a sentimental connection to each other can just as easily slip into a ideology or a formula for acquiring political will, which is not necessarily bad, because we need to have some sort of political will to protect society and some sort of unification within that. But you see from the left, or at least from the elite, that any sort of disturbance of American nationalism freaks them out, or they continually prop it up as controlled opposition.
So just to make a point there, the problem with an ideology is defined a priori from a position that is not interested in what the world is like. And so it describes what it wants in an idealistic way and then tries to format the world to fit that. The difference between that and this sentimental view of politics would be to take things as they are and try and imagine a slightly better future rather than reformat the entire world. So you are localizing the issue that you're trying to change rather than universalizing it, which is, I think, the inherent problem with ideologies. Because you're starting in the realm of the abstract and then coming into the real, rather than coming to the real. And then
I want to kiss him right now.
Right, because he's right on the money.
Right on the fucking money.
Trying to look slightly ahead. It works in different directions.
So on the topic of ideology, just to kind of put it out there, and maybe this will help you since you're working on a project with it, Carl. I don't know if you've ever read, you mentioned critical race theory. I don't know if you've ever read this book called, what's it called? From Class to Race by Charles Mills. And so the first chapter, I had to read this thing forever, and I finally sucked it up and read it. And the first chapter actually is Charles Mills, who's he recently died, like last year or something, or the year before. He's a very famous, I've been told I'm not allowed to call him a critical race theorist because he's a critical philosopher of race, and we can all go off in our leftist circles and jerk around or whatever we do now. Anyway, the first chapter, he basically lays out literally a claim that everybody who's a Marxist ever misunderstood Marx about ideology. And he gives the most cogent explanation of what it is that I think I've ever read. It's one of the most valuable chapters I've ever read in my life, I think. And what he mostly is doing is taking apart other Marxists and saying how inadequate they are, which is, for me, just, great. But the definition kind of boils down to that.
He's actually right. I mean, that chapter is absolutely positively worth a read, because he's actually brought it down to essentially very close to first principle, not in the science that we would say it, but at least in the rational sense. So if I don't forget, hopefully I'll put a link to that. If he hasn't said it here, I'll put a link to that in the video.
It is the mythology that the ruling class kind of semi-organically, but sometimes deliberately weaves in order to justify, maintain, and entrench its own power. And so it is a political mythology. And the reason I think that we see this rising within the Enlightenment is not specifically because of something to do with the Enlightenment, although perhaps I'm open to the contention, to the hypothesis. What I see happening in this regard is that when you said that,
I think he's talking about the counter-Enlightenment. It's not the.
I mean, this is one of my problems with this thing, is that there's what are we calling the Enlightenment? All right, I mean, that term appears to me to be used to describe the counter-Enlightenment, which begins with the French.
Yes.
Whereas in the English, I just see the classical restoration, and I call that the Enlightenment, right? And that's all purely scientific and empirical, and in the sense that they are trying to remove falsehoods that have irritated them.
So the Enlightenment would be to the French Revolution.
Correct.
And the counter-Enlightenment may be through the French Revolution.
It's actually Rousseau, right? It's through Rousseau.
Okay.
Rousseau is the canonical. You see some of it in Voltaire, but it's really Rousseau.
All right.
Rousseau, that pervert, is really the guy who kicks it off, and it's really Rousseau and Marx, and you know, and I could blame Hegel a little bit, but Rousseau, Hegel, and Marx, that sort of create the tragedy of the three civilizations, the French, the German, and the Jewish, counter revolutions against it. I mean, if you look at the Russian, it's purely literary, right? And in that sense that it doesn't hyper rationalize, which is kind of beautiful. I mean, the more you study Russian literature, the more genius it is, and the greater the loss. Right? The greater the loss of Russian literature after the communists, because it really is, it's an unpretentious set of parables about the difficulty of the human condition without this utopian nonsense. And I actually think that and it's unfortunate that Rousseau and that French nonsense takes root. It's unfortunate that the French basically destroy Europe with the Napoleonic expansion and the invention of total war. And so those two things together, even what we see today, which is the continental law or Napoleonic law, that's a catastrophe versus the empiricism of Germanic common law. So
it clicked with you with the Gnosticism. I think that what we saw is that the kind of Gnostic architects that were kind of operating in parallel, and not even in parallel, literally mixed in. I said miasma earlier, and I really mean it. There was no real distinction between mystics and scientists and philosophers and even theologians sort of throughout Europe in the late Middle Ages, early modern period. There just wasn't. Francis Bacon, which one was he? All of them. So what are you going to do? Newton, several of them at once. You go to the Swabian Pietist theologians from which Hegel and Marx derive. Several at once. It's just mixed together. This is the problem with thinking from 300-400 years ago, is we hadn't clarified some of these things. And so what I see there is that the Gnostic project got moved into politics, sociology, and economics very deliberately. And the reason I actually say that Hegel is the one who codified this, I don't think it's his doing. We might blame Kant. We could definitely blame Rousseau, who I fear you sound a little bit like.
I'm very familiar with Rousseau.
And so
I can explain why I'm not.
I'm nervous that the project you've outlined tends in the Rousseauian direction, without some guardrails at least. The sentimentality, the attempt to get back to sensuousness as a meaning, as a basis for understanding reality. But I don't disagree with you about the body being the center of our experience and the mind. I'm also famously an atheist, aka.
That's a great example of you're trying to use the existing tools to solve the problem of greater precision than the existing tools allow, right? I mean, so they're still trying to solve this problem within the frames they understand, but saying, well, in the 1800s, scale just increased vastly. And so none of the tools, the conceptual tools we had, were sufficient. And now we're getting into where, we can't even measure things without AIs. I mean, people don't think of what we call artificial intelligence today as just Bayesian accounting. I mean, that's all it is. It's an accounting system, right? And so we say, okay, we can't measure this stuff without AIs because humans can't do that, right? But that's all it is you don't think of a computing as a superior system of measurement. Simulation is a superior system of measurement, or AI or Bayesian accounting. I really we have to distinguish between those two, because this is not intelligent. It's just Bayesian accounting. And these things are just too big of scale. And so the problem you get into is how do you falsify things, not how do you justify things. And so they're using the wrong technology.
I think it will be useful for the audience to, how do you falsify things? What exactly do you mean by that, Curt?
It's the example I use all the time is clay versus stone. You justify a thing the way a sculptor makes something out of clay by intent, right? But he already has to know what he wants to make, right? I mean, but a sculptor removes falsehoods, right, from the stone to expose the thing underneath. And to some degree, which Michelangelo would say all the time, it's in there, I got to bring it out, right? But, the problem is the stone determines what you can bring out of it, whereas the clay doesn't, right? I mean, it can go all sorts of places. So via negativa is what science is. Science doesn't prove anything, it disproves things. And so what we do is we come up all this. So what's the difference? The difference is justification is cheap. It's just wayfinding, pathfinding. Yes, I got from here to there, right? But what's falsification? I get to know what enough to be able to remove all the stone that's false. So what's happened over the past century and a half is that we know a lot of stuff now. We know what's false. We couldn't defeat communism because people said it could happen. But once you have the evidence, you now can explain why it can't. Right? I mean, there's all these other things, right? I mean, and right now we're falsifying feminism, right? I mean, that's what's happening around. But so the problem is falsification is a scale problem, but the scale problem means you need vastly more knowledge and vastly more precise measurements in order to take care of things. And what happened in the 1800s, of course, is for the Industrial Revolution really happened just slightly before that in the late 1700s, is the scale of things we were trying to understand got out of hand. Now, it's one thing to scale the planets, right? I mean, how do we look about orbits and gravity? It's quite another thing to talk about economies, because economies aren't as regular as a physical phenomenon, because people are heuristic. They adapt all the time, right? So this got very, very complicated. And so we have to talk about limits instead of wants. Does that make sense? So falsificationary systems are looking for limits at the end and at the beginning, right? And anything between them, and a full accounting of anything in between them. And so we just reached the point where we can't any longer use excuses, justification for anything, because now we've got to know the limits, and we've got to know the falsehoods and all the other stuff around it. And I'm trying to end this topic without in other words, because I don't want to go into a 2-hour dissertation on this stuff. But I mean, that's basically what happened, is that when scale gets large enough, you have to go from positiva to negativa, and negativa falsification. And so all we do is we remove what's false, and whatever is left survives. If you remove enough falsehood, you end up with a first principle. Once you've got a first principle or set of first principles, there's only one to the universe. So and it just exposes itself in different ways, evolutionary computation. Then once you realize that that's the case, now you have a universal system of measurement, because a universal system of falsification. So we have that available to us. And fortunately, philosophy is still essentially an archaic but highly accessible system of thought, whereas falsificationary science is a current but extremely costly and very difficult to access system of thought. And just to show where this goes, you can't introspect on your own movement, right? You can't introspect on how you move your arm there. It just goes there. You can't introspect on a Bayesian algorithm for the same fucking reason. So there are things that we can falsify, and there are things that we can only run simulations on, develop limits. We may never know the internal mechanisms of it.
America's top Christian nationalist, but that's
I'm
my
also
other
a Christian nationalist.
Oh, really?
Well,
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, we're at the forefront of this movement that's definitely not a Fed operation in the United States at all, like the most obvious one that's ever been created. Like watching them just jump into it. But no, what I see though is that I see that the mysticism got moved into politics, into the realm of politics. And I think Hegel codified this with phenomena.
So their view of liberalism is not rule of law. Fundamentally, it's not rule of law.
They're philosophical in their
They're philosophical, so they're French. This is the fundamental difference between the grammars and between the segments of the movement.
That was right rude, Curt.
I don't
That was about I've never heard you be so rude.
Is that rude?
You called them French, man. That's so rude. That's like that. Like no, that would.
Well, James talks about this miasma was a very romantic notion, but it's just a competition between grammars, logics, right?
Yes.
Right. And they're like, well, those people had all of them. Well, they've got them too.
Oh, yes.
Right. I mean, James is right about Carl in saying, well, you're going to go down to the Rousseau path, right? And then Carl isn't criticizing James, but James is headed toward the theological path. He doesn't
Ah.
recognize that. When the answer is, it's either rule of law, which is decidability, or it's fucking opinion. And the difference is what with rule of law or measurements, right? Empirical, ordinal logic, things are decidable. Everything's decidable. You don't have to like it. You can vary from it as long as you realize you're going to pay the cost of it. But it's just human behavior is just as scientific as chemistry, right? At the science level. So we just go out and say, okay, well, they just don't know that. So they're trapped in their metaphor. But realistically, classical liberalism, as I understand it, is rule of law, and liberalism as it's being used here and in the present sense is French utopianism, and Marxism is authoritarian. The Marxist spectrum is authoritarian liberalism. So I mean, I don't know.
Wait. So the issue is here. I will have a contention with your terminology just a little bit.
Okay.
It's not that they're trapped; they have yet to evolve beyond.
Oh, I'm not.
Current
I love these guys, right? It's not a.
Yes, no, I understand. I'm just like
I don't mean it as a negative. I mean, I don't mean they're not willfully there.
No,
but,
I understand.
I mean,
I had to bring that in just because.
Well, I've already made James mad at me once.
Oh, really?
Well, yeah, I was on Twitter, and I'm like, I'm pissed that he's been so incautious that he got kicked off of Twitter. And so I said something, and he didn't like it. So I mean, I was like, well, you know, it's not about you; it's about you're depriving us of you, right? I mean, by your incaution, now we don't get the benefit of you, right? And so I'm like, I thought it is like a hero worship thing, but he found it offensive. So I don't know. I mean, we all
knowledge of spirit. In fact, this is sort of the other day, believe it or not, I tweeted, I just spent half my day reading Judith Butler, and it was surprisingly clarifying. First of all, I shocked myself. I don't know if you've had the pleasure.
I've read Gender Trouble.
Yeah, well, as you know, it's a slightly painful book to read. Didn't she win like first place or second place in like worst sentence ever contest or the worst writing ever or something?
I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if she did.
I can sit down and read Judith Butler straight through. Like it's not that hard now. Like,
you found out the Judith code?
Well, I just know what the words mean and how they construct sentences, so it's really not that complicated.
I had the same thing with the dialectic of sex. I can't remember.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah,
that was one of the first theory books I tried to read. Total gibberish. After about 4 years of studying it, I went back and reread it. I was like, I can get this.
Yeah.
It took a long time.
And Fausto Sterling, that's what we're looking for.
They're just honest to Pete. Like it's just gibberish. And it took me 4 years of study, and now I can read it. I'm like, good God, these guys deserve a medal.
really. I mean, I just get angry.
I was impressed by him years ago when he started doing this, and I'm like, because I can't stand it. I won't do it because it's a waste of time. It's like there's no sense in reading gibberish from people who speak Jabberwocky. It makes no sense.
Well, I would say that once you just reduce it to lying in order to power, it doesn't really matter how they're lying. It just matters that they're lying in pursuit of power. And so I just look at it as, okay, well, how do I end the capacity to lie in public to the public and matters public? Well, that was hard work. It wasn't, it sounds like arrogant, but it wasn't as hard as you'd think. Religion was hard. Lying wasn't that hard because people are really good at it, but there's so much of it out there now that you can break down lying fairly into a methodology pretty easily.
Wait, so I think this is good. This is a good stopping place, to be honest with you.
Okay.
The issue
We
is
made it like 30 minutes into their thing.
That's okay. It's
Okay.
like good, but it's a good short, concise piece, right? With some interjections that are useful. And I think that the fact is they're on the right track, and they lack some precision that we can provide.
I think it's hard. I think our work is hard. I think that if you even look at the people who work in the law, like, I mean, I actually, there are only two people in legal theory I can look to and say they're not so far off base, it's pointless to study them. Right. I mean, and they're just a generation apart. They're the same guy, a generation apart, right? So I mean, I actually think what we do is like, I think what we do is very difficult, but Not because I think it's difficult, but because my observation is that that unlearning
Yes.
is extreme. Unlearning the falsehoods is
Well, the
extremely
issue
difficult.
is behavioral economics is working against everybody.
Yes.
And that's the problem is this: if you have an investment, so a behavioral investment, and you're unwilling to part with it.
Or that the power you have to jump lily pads with this existing knowledge is so rewarding, and so it actually takes you pretty far. Whereas now you're stuck with, I can only get to the next lily pad. And so I'm frustrated, but then I got to get to, where do I go from that one? And you keep reaching to the old lily pad path, right? Because for answers, and they're not there. Right. And so I just think it's hard. It's why I think our reducing our work down to, the 20 some odd principles there, and, the grammars and whatever is just what's necessary for a reasonably smart person to say, oh, I see, this is just math.
Well, I know, but it's like this. Okay, look, we're talking about these two gentlemen who are talking, and it's like this. Carl just said he spent 4 years and he was able to read that book that is not worth reading.
Yes.
And it's like, we know that he's willing to work, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, but on the other hand, I would say that James is doing a huge service, intellectual service to mankind, really.
Yes.
And it needs to be done, because without falsifying something on its terms, right, you are stuck with the potential of resurrection, of continuous resurrection. Right.
So he's driving the stake in the heart of it.
He is, and we both joke about this all the time, about how we can't believe he has the stomach for it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I just see lie after lie after lie after lie after lie.
Yeah.
Angry. I just can't do it. And so I said, I go through, so this lie is constructed by this means.
Yes.
This lie is constructed by this means, and it makes me so angry. I'm just like, I fucking hang him. Right. But I mean, conversely, there's two things to be learned. Look at how sophisticated humans can become at lying, which is what I. And then James is like, look at how they pull this shit off. Look at the way they're doing this logic, but it's all, in the end, it's just about power, right? It's just to take power, but it's not power for good means. Right? It's power for people who lack demonstrated competency. Right? I mean, that was the whole virtue of aristocracy. We don't, people think of aristocracy as inheritance, but that's a later thing. Aristocracy means natural aristocracy, means demonstrated competency, right? I mean, what we want is to be run by people with demonstrated competency. Can a credential system produce demonstrated competency? No, it can produce only the skills necessary to pursue demonstrated competency.
Yes.
It cannot produce demonstrated competency. All right. So does that mean we're done talking about these guys, or does that mean that we
No,
should...
I don't. We could continue to study that work at another time if you like.
Great. Let's do that. I think there's more to be had there.
There is. They are doing a great job. And it's just a matter of, there's good, the interjections I think are useful and insightful and meaningful, and provide illumination for everybody, and we'll see what goes from there.
All right. So are we done for the day?
If you like.
Okay. I appreciate. I have some administrivia to go over with you. So if we can hang on I'll just end the recording. Okay, this is Curt and Brad on Sundays, February 5th. We've just finished a brief review of Sargon, Carl Benjamin, and James Lindsay, and their exceptional talk on liberalism, which was Wonderful. All right, and we'll talk to you next.
Thanks for coming.